The Federal Bureau of Investigation is one of the most culturally significant branches of the United States government. They serve to protect the United States from terrorist attacks, foreign intelligence operations, espionage, combat public corruption, and protect civil rights. At least, that's what they claim to do on their website. In reality, most of the time when people think of the FBI, they think of TV and film. A small-time detective is close to solving the case only for the FBI to come in and try and sweep the case away from him. Or, a mystery is so big that it requires two FBI agents with their own problems to come in and try and tie everything together buddy cop style. You think of things like The X-Files, Point Break, Silence of the Lambs, Seven, hell, even The Fast and the Furious was originally about an FBI agent.
Drop it, I don't want to talk about it.
Drop it, hell. I want to hear about this, homie.
I said forget about it, cuz.
The FBI is the go-to organization for telling a story about crime and mystery, with the iconic jackets with the big yellow text signifying that this adventure is here and is some real shit. And unfortunately, I am a sucker for these types of stories. I already spoke in detail all those years ago about Alan Wake 2 when that game released, and it's still one of my favorite games of all time. That game follows an FBI agent as she's dragged around into a mystery so much bigger than her, yet it's one that revolves entirely around her because of the machinations of one egotistical writer. She discovers her past has been changed because of this story, and throughout the game we see and read echoes of what once was her life. Alan Wake 2 was a monumental title for me as it struck me at just the right moment and created an experience I would never forget. Resident Evil Requiem harnesses a lot of what made Alan Wake 2 special in my eyes, but it reformats it into that all too familiar Resident Evil coat of paint. It encompasses the entire franchise while also slimming down the fat of other entries and creates a very compact experience that knows exactly what it's trying to do. Resident Evil Requiem is a split between two camps, one of horror and one of action, where both are given just about equal footing to create an experience reminiscent of the past yet not derivative. This year marks the 30th anniversary of Resident Evil, and while the developers stated that this game wasn't meant to be an anniversary title or a best of title, the game still works as a pseudo-anniversary title as it's a story about coming to terms with the past. It works to uncover secrets and put them to rest at the same time. Our main characters will reflect on this throughout their journey, and the subtitle for the game even goes as far as to explicitly tell you what the game's narrative is about. A requiem is defined as a religious service or a musical composition for a dead person. It's a time of mourning, but also a time of reflection. A moment where you look at everything that has led up to the present and reconcile, not only with yourself, but with the world around you in order to give yourself closure. Resident Evil, as a series, has spent decades trying to redefine itself over and over again as to not fall into irrelevancy, while also constantly being the standard for survival horror, if that makes sense. With each reinvention of itself, Resident Evil has had to leave aspects of itself behind in order to adapt. After Code Veronica, the series abandoned fixed camera angles for the most part, as Resident Evil 4 was a genre-defining title that left its legacy on almost every third-person shooter to release since 2005. But after they shifted too hard and went into third-person shooters and bombastic set pieces, the camera angle itself was left behind as the series again rebranded with Resident Evil 7 shifting into the first person. The shift to first person re-emphasized the horror of Resident Evil and reminded people that these games could actually be scary. Then, they shifted back into the third person with Resident Evil 2 Remake, where they took what they learned in 7 and moved it over into something a little more traditional. Within this post-Resident Evil 7 world, Capcom has been shifting back into action with the remakes of 3, 4, and the release of Village, and now everything has come full circle again. Where Resident Evil 6 originally decided to go all out on everything and ended up creating a hodgepodge of horror-themed amusement park rides, Resident Evil Requiem finds a balance between horror and action to create something that truly feels like Resident Evil, kind of what Resident Evil 6 was going for all those years ago, but clearly stumbled when trying to achieve. Resident Evil Requiem relies on the past to look to the future. It's a game focused on the history of the franchise while also finding a balance that no single Resident Evil has truly been able to maintain up to this point. The echoes of Resident Evil's past not only speak up narratively, but the entire experience this time around is built on Resident Evil's past. Naturally, this interested me because when a game goes all out on nostalgia, it really seems derivative. It feels annoying, it feels tedious, it feels whatever adjective you want want to apply to it, but here it works really well, and I want to investigate why. I want to investigate why I played this game 5 times over and got all the achievements, since I rarely do that with games. This is a critique and analysis, whatever you want to call it, on Resident Evil Requiem. Before I start, obvious spoiler warning ahead, as I'm going to talk about the entire game in detail, and I just wanted to say that if you enjoy these videos, please consider commenting, liking, subscribing, all that jazz, as it helps the channel a lot. I also have a Patreon. With that out of the way, let's jump right in.
I've done it. I've done it.
The game opens on an FBI field office in the Midwest as we meet one of our protagonists, Grace. She's writing a report about a string of murders across the Midwest, and we see that Raccoon City's lockdown has been extended until 2040 after a missile wiped out the city at the end of Resident Evil 2 and 3 back in 1998. The camera doesn't linger on it for too long, but what it does is it gets Raccoon City in the mind of the player. You're thinking about the city, and you're wondering, why is the city still on lockdown? They bombed it 30 years ago. Even if it was nuclear, the radiation would have settled by now. But that's for later. Right now, I want to talk about Grace, since the intro does a very good job at establishing who Grace is without delving too deep into her just yet. When we first see her, we see her body language and the way that she sits in the chair. It's very telling. She's got knees up, she's hunched over her computer. It shows that she's not the most social person in the office, and the way she jumps when her boss knocks on her cubicle just shows us how deep she gets sucked into her work. She exists in her own little bubble. She's a data analyst who mainly keeps to herself, and one of the files in the game says she doesn't leave the office much, and when she does, it's usually after midnight. Just by looking at Grace, we can see that she clearly has a lot on her mind at all times, and this is made even more clear when her boss tells her that she needs to investigate a murder scene at the Redwood Hotel. She instantly shuts down more than before, and her boss tells her that she needs to face the past. Facing the past is the core theme of Resident Evil Requiem. It's where the Requiem part of the title comes from. Grace's past comes at her full swing at the Redwood Hotel because upon arriving, she sees that it was all a setup. All around there's pictures of her, but in room 204, her focus shifts to a specific picture from 8 years ago. We cut back to when that picture was taken. In the same hotel, her and her mother, Alyssa Ashcroft, a character from Resident Evil Outbreak on the PS2, learn that they are being followed, so they try to escape from the hotel, but a masked man kills the hotel manager. Walk him down, Alyssa Ashcroft puts a couple bullets in him, and they think they're safe until the masked man suddenly comes back and gives Alyssa an axe to the neck. But if we just pause on that axe in the neck for a second, I'm sure she won't mind. I want to talk about Alyssa real quick because I like how she's merged into the plot of this game, and despite being written off so early, it was neat for a more niche Resident Evil character to make an appearance in this game, considering how much of the game is about Raccoon City. At the time of writing, there was actually some pre-release gameplay shown where the game had a co-op action approach similar to Resident Evil 5, and part of me believes that this game would have almost been a sequel to Resident Evil Outbreak, where Alyssa and the other survivors would have had a larger role maybe. But that's just my little crackpot theory though. I'm glad it didn't turn out that way, because as it stands, Requiem is one of the best original entries in a long time. But with that little tangent aside, we can cut back to Alyssa in the axe in the neck, where we see the masked man fall over and succumb to his gunshot wounds. On his way down, he knocks over a lamp, which causes the building to catch fire. That gives me just enough time to talk about the standout aspect of this game, and that is the performance that Angela Santinalbo gives as Grace. The performance of the main character is often important when it comes to selling the horror, but you don't need me to tell you that. Each iteration of Leon works so well because when he falls into that more action-oriented gameplay from RE4 onwards, it fits his jokey nature. His gameplay is unserious, and so is he, but I'll talk about him a little more later on. Grace is the exact opposite of Leon. It gives the game good contrast, but also the performance from Sant Albino allows Grace to be in a constant state of nearly shit her pants, and that transfers over to the player, especially when you factor in the different camera angles and how they affect the player and how the player perceives the game world. By default, Grace's camera is set to the first person, and that's how I played the game initially. It beckons back to why Resident Evil 7 and its grunge house horror works so well, because you genuinely feel like you're center stage in the horror. Whenever Grace does something with her hands, you see it. Whenever she gasps, you gasp. It sells the illusion of being trapped in the horror, and it works well when you play in first person. I don't typically get scared of horror games, but during the sections a bit later on in the care center as Grace, I could feel my heart start thumping as I turned a corner to see a horde of enemies, or one of the various pursuit enemies that follow you around, Mr. X style. Your limited field of view gives not just the care center, but anywhere you go as Grace, a claustrophobic feeling that increases tenfold in the basement portion of the game, where everything is dark and your vision is cut back even further. The game also offers a third-person perspective for Grace, and despite first-person being the intended experience on subsequent playthroughs, I found myself resonating with the third-person perspective a lot more because of small things that change when the camera changes. While the first person sucks you into the horror, like I mentioned earlier, the third-person perspective feels like it takes away agency from Grace, and byproduct, the player. When a large enemy is in pursuit of Grace, she will start sprinting down the hall, and when she's sprinting, she will tumble over, causing the player to temporarily lose control of her movement. A lot of this is actually covered within the first level as you explore the hotel. It covers the first-person perspective when there's a forced set piece where you have to dodge a shotgun and move in first person and hold off a now infected cop you spoke to earlier. The camera seamlessly moves away from the grotesque face of the cop back into the third person or continues in first person. If you go to third person, you stumble up the hallway and eventually up the stairs where you shove him out of a window, and if you're in first person, the whole thing remains immersive. So as of now, Grace is not having a good day. She just pushed that cop out the window, and instead of the hotel being a sufficient enough lead with anything, she instead finds out the real reason why a body and photos were at the hotel. A strange man with a deformed face reveals that this was all a setup to get Grace to be on her own for once, and then promptly knocks her out. She wakes up confused and upside down with an IV connected to her arm, draining her of blood. Whatever place she's trapped in is quiet. Too quiet. She goes to look for a way out, but while looking for a fuse she needs to open a door, she's met face to face with a strange girl. She looks a bit like an overgrown, more monsterish version of Lisa Trevor from the remake of Resident Evil. We notice she has an aversion to bright lights and hides for a moment until we make a loud noise that attracts her again. When I had initially played this game, I was utterly terrified of this girl. The way she moved, the sounds of her footsteps, the way the game had her patrol this small space left me on edge. The sounds of her footsteps almost being drowned out by the chains makes it hard to grasp just how far away she is, but it fills you with this sense of dread since you know she's coming, but from how far away remains a mystery. I want to take a moment and point out how dark this game is. When playing the game, there are moments where I genuinely was not able to see what was 2 feet in front of me, despite having a source of light. This isn't me dragging the game either. It's electric when you're in the moment as Grace, and the sections get so dark you can't see a goddamn thing. The fact that the game is so dark works in tandem with the rest of the horror to create an atmosphere that is just immaculate and makes you terrified to leave the safe room. There's a better section later on that takes advantage of not only the girl but the dark, but I'll save that for when we get there. This section is pretty short as it acts as a tutorial for Grace's survival horror gameplay with the more cat and mouse dynamic, not too dissimilar from Mr. X in the remake of Resident Evil 2 or Nemesis in the original Resident Evil 3. The section ends once you unlock the door with the fuse, but Grace doesn't get off scot-free. The girl tries to drag Grace back into the darkness, but you're saved by a gunshot just out of frame. The gunshot, coming from a government agent we're all too familiar with at this point.
Talk to me. Is this one like the others?
Talk to me. Is this one like the others? A familiar voice says on the radio. This is the 6th victim with the same black blotches across their body. The common thread? They're all survivors of the Raccoon City incident, and Leon S. Kennedy is trying to figure out what's going on because he and his handler for this mission, one Sherry Birkin, are suffering from similar infections that seem to be killing these Raccoon City survivors. As he's investigating one of the bodies, he's tipped off to a potential person of interest, an Umbrella researcher named Victor Gideon. As it turns out, he's not far out, and he's got Grace thrown over his shoulder like a bag of potatoes, so Leon catches this out of the window of his Porsche K9 Turbo GT and stops to investigate this, but Gideon starts turning people into infected monsters with his big Infect People gun. The streets become filled with infected and Leon doesn't wait to get to work. From here we can see just how much of this game has iterated on Resident Evil 4's remake from a few years prior. Despite Leon being much older here than in his previous game, he moves a bit more fluidly than he did in that game. He doesn't suplex people, but instead he works within a fashion that's a little more substance over style. His body doesn't quite move how it used to. That's not to say he can't move. Like I said, he's incredibly fluid in this game, and it makes it easy to fall in this flow state when playing as Leon, even in these first few sections where the gameplay is very short. When playing as Leon, your arsenal consists mainly of two tools, your gun and your axe. Replacing the knife from RE4's remake with an axe that you have to sharpen instead of find a replacement for was a great change in my opinion because it keeps up that flow of combat and play. Where RE4 was about resource management, the Leon portions of this game are more about survival and utilizing all your tools to the fullest while you have them. As an example, during this opening section, you have something known as the Requiem. It's this big ass revolver that deals massive damage, often killing non-boss enemies in a single hit, but the trade-off is that it doesn't have a lot of ammo. Someone who's played these games before would understand the trade-off in choosing to save ammo, but what this game teaches you when you're playing as Leon is that during his sections you should just let it rip and use it as much as you need to in order to survive. During Insanity mode, you're essentially forced to use the Requiem as much as possible while also parrying in order to stun enemies in order to line up shots with the Requiem because it does pierce enemies and you need to save ammo because it doesn't have a lot of ammo despite your need to use it. But during the short section in the streets, Gideon gets away and Leon remarks that they're back to square one. But it turns out that Gideon owns a place called the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, so Leon follows that carrot on the stick. Upon arriving at the care center, he's greeted by a nurse who is seemingly unaware of any wrongdoings aside from the controversial nature of the facility, as this facility primarily focuses on experimental therapies. I'll talk about the care center a bit in just a moment, but of course this facility has more to it beyond the surface, and this is made clear soon after we arrive since we hear the intercom talk about a Code 6 lockdown, and as the nurse comes to get us, she's cut down with a chainsaw. The section that follows is primarily here to show us how much of a power fantasy playing as Leon is in this game, and it again serves to contrast Grace's horror sections. Here we get to pick up and wield a chainsaw and use it against a dozen or so zombies that infest the ward, and what makes the chainsaw fun is how it's also a tool of the zombies. When you initially knock the chainsaw out of the hands of the zombie that spawns with it, it can do a few things. Firstly, it'll spin on the ground hurting anyone who gets near it, which makes it a fun little mini game if you want to pick it up before a zombie does. You must wait for the chainsaw to take a temporary break from spinning and pick it up fast. If you don't pick it up, a zombie will, and the weight of the chainsaw will either drag them towards you or they'll pick it up and start swinging it your way, where they can then repeat the process of gathering the saw. When you pick it up, it tears through the zombies on lower difficulties, which makes it a whole lot of fun to play with, but once you've used it for a little too long, the saw will either get stuck in a zombie, which repeats the process of trying to shoot the zombie and make sure they don't pick up the saw. This whole balancing act is essentially nullified on Insanity, where it's fucking useless, so all you want to do is just make sure the zombies don't grab it. But when playing on normal mode or classic mode, the saw is a bit more useful. If anything, it feels close to playing the modern Doom reboot trilogy, where you're constantly switching tools between your weapons, your axe, and the chainsaw while you're surrounded by enemies. But once you've cleared out that room, you make your way upstairs and find Grace being dragged away like we last saw her. You shoot the girl grabbing her and then switch places with Grace, as when you're asking her questions, Gideon brings down a gate that separates the two and leads you two down different paths. Leon gives Grace the Requiem with one bullet because he's an asshole, and Gideon knocks out Leon and takes him away, leaving Grace on her own once again. I really like how the scenarios work in this game because we see two stories happening in conjunction with one another, where one person's actions affect the other's campaign and vice versa. But unlike Resident Evil 2 and its remake, these aren't separate campaigns you load into, and instead you have about equal playtime between both characters and switch between them every so often, with Grace getting the majority of the front half of the game while Leon gets the back half. Whenever you switch characters, the previous story is left on a loose thread that you'll come back to later, and it makes you eager to continue playing so you can get back and see what happens next. But with how this game is paced, you often forget about the thread just before you have to switch characters again, repeating the process. I really love this structure for the game. I will note though that I found Grace's main plot to be a bit more interesting than what happens during the Leon playthrough, as Grace in my eyes is the more interesting character for this game. This may be because she's the newcomer, so the very nature of the game relies on her story being the main hook and requiring a bit more development, but even so, I think Leon should have had a bit more to do in the story to justify his involvement. His main arc throughout the game is coming to terms with the fact that he can't save everyone and how he still feels guilty about that dreaded day, that fateful September 30th, 1998, his first day on the job as a rookie cop, but that's all he does in the story when he gets any development at all. To me, the primary goal of Leon is to help Grace's campaign move along with a secondary character, and he does that job well. He's more of a pace breaker than a true B scenario like I mentioned earlier, but he's still a treat to have in this game. He's just as quippy and as full of bad puns as he was before, which has led to some people calling for Flanderization of Leon, which I disagree with on two principles. The first is that if this was true Flanderization, he would only be making quips and bringing up Raccoon City, September 30th, 1998. But throughout the game, we see his guilt bleeding over from the events of Resident Evil 4 and 6, and while he doesn't directly mention them, we can feel the weight of it all on top of him. Ever since the original Resident Evil 4, Leon's always been silly and quippy. He's an action hero. That's what he does. He's not like Chris Redfield, who has this constant sadness and guilt over him because everyone he's captain over dies. Leon is a bit more of a silly character. He's a bit more free-flowing. You could do a lot more with Leon. The context of the remakes gives Leon a bit more depth, so he's not as flat as he used to be, which helps his case in Resident Evil Requiem. That's why I don't believe it to be Flanderization or whatever people are calling it. And that brings me to my second point. This is Resident Evil. Character work has never been the strongest part of any of these games. The characters can be fun, but these are schlocky B-horror movies translated into the world of video games. The whole idea of having this ensemble cast that needs constant attention and world building and lore just convolutes things, and while I do like these characters, the constant reuse of these characters has led to people essentially doing a Stan Wars around these characters, treating them like actual living, breathing people. Let's rewind a bit, shall we? Resident Evil 7 was a hit because for the majority of the game's runtime, it separated itself from the increasingly convoluted and messy bioweapons of war shtick that the previous games were constantly adding new threats to. That is, until you reach the third act of the game, where it ties itself back into everything that we've known with the boat sequence where you learn that Mia Winters, your wife, worked as an operative for the Connections, which is a whole different can of worms entirely. The boat sequence is commonly cited as the weakest point in the game, as it trades everything that worked in the rest of the game to tie back into the greater story of the franchise and give people the lore that they must need. The story of Ethan Winters was loved because he was a guy looking for his wife, a horror staple, and an easy stepping on point for the series. But then, with Resident Evil 8, the games instantly went back to following our ensemble cast with Chris Redfield and his bioweapons of war shtick and the BSAA, and it was for that reason I felt that game suffered as a sequel to Resident Evil 7. But how does that circle back around to Leon's character? My point of that little tangent was that, to me, the characterization of our cast matters less than the wider story being told. A common criticism I've seen is that Leon never mentions Claire or Jill in this game, despite them both being Raccoon City survivors, and to me, that's not important because I can assume Leon is thinking about these characters, especially since Sherry Birkin is his handler in the game. Focusing on Leon as a pace breaker and someone more in line with, but not quite comedic relief, allows for the game to not overdo either sense of action or horror. It maintains balance by focusing on Leon's sense of guilt as an individual for surviving Raccoon City while also showing us badass Leon, who says that Gideon has bad breath and refers to a rifle sitting on the floor as beautiful. But now it's time to sidetrack Leon for a bit. He's knocked out and we're back with Grace, who has exactly one bullet in the Requiem and a dream of escaping this facility, whatever it may be. If you couldn't gather already, this game is divided into two distinct playstyles, Leon and Grace. Leon gets the more action-oriented side of the game, falling in line with his appearances in 4 and 6, while Grace gets the survival horror gameplay loop that feels like classic Resident Evil mixed with 7. Grace is left all alone to explore the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center, and what makes this section feel so good to play is how utterly hopeless you feel for the first chunk of the experience. As I mentioned earlier, Grace is small and weak, so you have one bullet in the Requiem, and that's until you find some makeshift knives lying around and a few small handguns, as well as other tools to keep yourself alive. Her gameplay feels the most like classic Resident Evil because you spend a lot of the early game trying to run around zombies instead of fighting them head on, because if more than one tries to attack you, you're likely going to lose that fight. Grace has a shove move as a melee, but it quite literally does 0 damage and only triggers when you've stunned a zombie after a few hits, so it's more like a tool to position yourself and the zombies, since you can use the shove to bounce into other zombies or off the wall and quickly run around them. Combat with Grace isn't secondary per se, but it's not the primary focus. The focus of her gameplay lies within classic Resident Evil, like I've mentioned already 3 times, being stuck in a big house with some puzzles to solve and resources to manage. As the games have shifted towards action over the years, this sense of being lost was something that the games never really chose to replicate. Of course, this was deliberate, as linear levels fit the action gameplay loop much better, but every time I go back to the Spencer Mansion, the RPD, or the Baker House, there's a sense of something that was lost whenever they focus on action, and Requiem fills that void almost perfectly. As a part of this game feeling like an anniversary title, the Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center is such a fun place to explore. The whole thing feels kind of sinister yet sterile, like a retirement home. It's too clean, too tidy. The only time you see any sort of mess are in the areas where the zombies have already started to roam free. Any other time, the marble of the main hall and the wooden walls around the early parts of the east and west wing are spick and span despite the infected roaming around. One of my favorite little touches of Resident Evil games is how the main area, the main hall, usually is spick and span and clean. Enemies don't really attack you there, they don't follow you, they don't do much. It gives the player a bit of a safe space outside of save rooms. This idea is usually inverted a little bit when you introduce stalker enemies, but for the most part, these areas are usually safe, as you can tell when the stalker enemy is coming. But that's besides the point. I mentioned earlier that it reminds me of a retirement home, and retirement homes are often seen as this sort of very negative place, especially to older folk, as it's seen as a place you go when your family has essentially said, it's time for you to croak over sooner rather than later, so go away. For a lot of old people, it represents abandonment and fear of the future as you get older. The Rhodes Hill Chronic Care Center isn't quite a retirement home, it's more in line with a nursing home for the mentally ill, but the sentiment still stands, as its experimental surgeries and medicine often give the illusion of help when in reality it causes more harm than good. If we take a look at the medical wing, we can see zombies with IV drips attached to them. They're sensitive to noise, so if the player or anything makes a noise that's too loud near them, they go into attack mode and swing the IV around and scream bloody murder. During these violent outbursts, they scream and are constantly repeating phrases to themselves about how everything is too loud, how their head hurts, how they want everything to stop. Meanwhile, on the east wing of the facility, there's a staff office with a roulette table. There's a chef making custom meals for them. While one group suffers, another group gets to enjoy themselves, marked by a distinct separation between east and west. The game has you explore the west wing of the facility first, as when you check out a room that connects to the safe room, you find a little girl with cataracts locked in a glass box. A dying man tells you to stay away from her, and you take the keycard off his body after he dies, and you have no choice but to explore the facility so you can escape. The first place the game takes you with the keycard is the aforementioned kitchen, where a big chef is working on meals. He's stuck in a loop of prepping and chopping up the food, constantly jumping between meals and ingredients spread among the tables. He's one of the game's stalker enemies, so he's quite large and takes a lot of bullets to take down, but he gives you a good enough reward for killing him. But the thing I wanted to point out with the chef and a lot of other zombies is that they have cycles and patterns. The infected of this game don't just lifelessly roam around the halls like classic zombies going brains. Instead, the zombies are perpetually stuck within their last moments, often repeating their last words and thoughts. You'll walk around the care center and hear zombies say that they're sorry or how they didn't know. Didn't know what? We don't know. That's not important to us. It's only important to them in their fleeting moments of life. This not only humanizes the zombies, but honestly makes you feel a little bad before you make their heads explode with a single Requiem shot. When a zombie looks at you and says please, I feel the same way as when I'm playing Dying Light and I hear a viral saying that they're sorry as they run at me ready to claw off my face. As you explore the care center, you slowly uncover how you're supposed to escape, because in true Resident Evil fashion, the building was designed to have elaborate doors that require 3 trinkets to open for some reason. Grace even acknowledges this when you open the lounge door and it requires a gemstone to open. She says, "Weird, how do people normally get in here?" Within 3 saves spread around the facility, a quartz with a sun, a moon, and a star engraving lie, and you need to grab all 3 to open the door in the main hall. This reminded me most of the first Resident Evil game, where you had to explore the east and west sides of the manor in order to collect parts of a medallion that, when put together, would open up the larger part of the property altogether. I keep bringing up classic Resident Evil because, frankly, I just love those games. I love how much time the player has to think for themselves. Exploring the levels can take as long as you'd like in those games, but in this game, much like the others, the care center can take less than an hour, but most people, especially on a first playthrough, will spend significantly more time taking in all the details and checking every nook and cranny for resources. The care center, as a level, is great. It remains relatively free-form in what order you can approach objectives, but also provides you enough context as to not get completely lost like you could in something like the original Resident Evil. The only major complaint with this section, and the game as a whole, is the lack of puzzles, optional and mandatory. If we look back at the first 2 games, there were times where you could have portions of different puzzles taking up space in your inventory, unaware of what goes where and when you could possibly need it. Meanwhile, here, everything is pretty self-explanatory. It doesn't have as many missing pieces that require you to run from end to end over and over again. I've played through this game 5 times now, and each time I've not only gotten faster, but I've also gotten into a rhythm of play when it comes to the encounters and how I approach them. I grab all the pieces in the same order, I know what guns to buy off the start with Leon, and I know how to balance my resources, which enemies to kill and which to run by. It all comes together to make me feel like I'm speedrunning the game as a professional, when in reality I'm not even close to being a good speedrunner. And that's the basis that classic Resident Evil was built on. They were highly replayable games where they encouraged you to get faster and faster with increasing benefits for doing so. When you enter the survival horror, resource management is only one part of it during your first playthrough. On subsequent playthroughs, it matters, but not nearly as much, as you know what to do, where, and when. It creates this really fun balance of mastering a game, like a classic arcade game, but it still presents a more modern view of video games. But at this point, I'm just rambling, so let's see what Grace is up to. Right before we grab a second piece of the door, we have another run-in with Gideon. He tells us about something called Elpis, and he says Grace is unique, saying, quote, "My master made you who you are." Before any other questions could be asked or answered, an alarm blares and Gideon says Phase 2 is about to begin. Grace hauls ass out of the room, and one thing that I really like here is that it shows how Grace is a smart character. She not only blocks the doorknob to give herself some more time, but she pretends to run out of the room by hitting the door open and then hiding elsewhere. Things like that are not very common in horror, as horror is very tropey, but it's nice to see a smart character doing something smart for once. While Grace is trying to figure out how to get the last piece of the door, now is a better time than ever to talk about how Resident Evil Requiem deals with resource management. Grace and Leon both have to manage resources, but this game strikes a pretty good balance in how each character has to deal with said resources. Grace has a more traditional Resident Evil inventory with 8 slots that you could expand with fanny packs throughout the game. With Grace, you'll need to run to the item box every so often and throw away things because guns, ammos, knives, crafting materials, health items, puzzles, key items all take up precious inventory space, especially if you start carrying around charms that make things like combat easier or increase your health. You'll need to constantly drop things off for later and come back around to them. Much like the classic games, however, if you're playing through the game a second, third, fourth, fifth time, you should be able to know how to balance your inventory in the moment. You know what goes where, so you can hold on to only the important stuff and come back for the stuff you need when you have free space. You won't have to worry about lockpicks, healing items, or knives because you won't be using them as much because you know what's good and what isn't. One aspect of the game that I thought was pretty cool was the blood collection aspect. In order to craft, Grace has a device that collects blood. My first time throughout the game, I thought it was something that the game clearly showed you and asked you to pick up. However, when I was doing my speedrun playthrough where I didn't collect any blood or heal, I discovered that the entire blood collection aspect of the game was optional. I had explored in my first playthrough, which led me to it, and I figured it was mandatory, or at least very heavily signposted to the player. But I learned that someone who doesn't explore could easily just walk by and play the entire game without crafting by accident. And I love that about the game. I love that about survival horror in general. It's all about mind games. The blood collection takes up an inventory slot, so you have to play a game of memorization and pathing out. Do you want to pick up the blood collector and be able to craft, or do you want to leave it so you can pick up other items? These games all overload you with items as to stress you out initially, but when returning, you can see that each item is methodically placed around a level. Leon doesn't share a menu with Grace. He doesn't even have access to the item box. Instead, Leon just has a big old briefcase full of weapons from Resident Evil 4, and sorting items is just as fun as it was back in 2005. His balancing comes not from collecting key items and puzzle items and watching his 8 slots fill up. Instead, it comes from watching each weapon you pick up take up a large amount of space, leaving little room for everything else in theory. In reality, you'll have plenty of room for everything in this game, but that's besides the point. If you're like me and pick up a lot of weapons, you'll find that Leon will quickly have maybe a third of his inventory free for healing and key items towards the end of the game, even less if you decide to pick up the rocket launcher on subsequent playthroughs. The fact that each character has a unique inventory goes to enhance the feeling that the game is giving you something of an A-B playthrough, as whenever you jump between characters, you have a different management game to go through, and the inventory of one character does not affect the inventory of the other. I mentioned earlier that Leon doesn't have access to an item box, not a shared one or even an individual one. He has a store where he can buy guns, ammo, and healing items, but he has no item box, and what this does is emphasize his playstyle. Sometimes you just need to leave things behind as you don't have enough room. He's always moving forward in gameplay. His sections are so linear that you never really feel like you're missing out the same way that Grace does. Instead, your focus is on ammo and clearing rooms full of enemies. His resource management is a numbers game, while Grace is more of a strategic balance of items. But that's enough item talk. Grace almost gets crushed by a bulldozer, so now shit's ramping up, and we're getting close to that third piece. But there's a big caveat. She can't read Braille, and pictures of the code she needed has faded away. Luckily for her, the little blind child from the start of the level is still chilling in her box, so you need to escort her to the last safe so she can open it. When escorting the girl, Emily, you must avoid zombies and whatever roaming enemies are in the area, and you can't shoot or do anything while holding her, so this game does something pretty cool. In any other game this would be annoying, but since Resident Evil 9 keeps the state of zombies in mind when continuously exploring, you can just go kill every zombie and just walk freely. And what makes it even cooler is that when you come back to an area as Leon, any zombies that Grace killed stay dead. So you could come back as Leon and the walls will be covered in blood because Walk 'em Down Grace just decided to go kill everyone with the Requiem. The only downside to this is that if you do kill everyone as Grace, when you go through the area as Leon, the levels can feel a bit empty, like you have nothing to do, so it kind of cuts down on the Leon-centric gameplay just a little bit. It's not all sunshine and roses, however. Much like the remake of Resident Evil, the bodies linger, and any zombie not killed by a headshot has a chance of coming back as what is called a blister head. Much like the Crimson Heads in the aforementioned remake, these zombies are faster, tougher, and they hit a lot harder. They can even kill you in one shot if they hit you with their little lunge move, a move that has killed me my fair share of times and pissed me off just as many times. The only way to make sure that this doesn't happen is to either kill them with a headshot like I mentioned a second ago, or to use something called the hemolytic injector to make the zombie bubble up and then completely explode, much like how the lighter and the kerosene was used in the remake of Resident Evil 1 to burn zombie corpses. Akin to the kerosene, it's a rare material, but unlike the kerosene, it's craftable, so you're limited by what's on the map, but not nearly as much as you were with the kerosene. The hemolytic injector can often act as Grace's main way of attacking enemies, as if you sneak behind an enemy, or in the case of the stalker enemies, get them low enough, you can kill them instantly with the injector with zero way for them to come back. What makes it interesting is that Leon doesn't have this at all. During his sections, he will fight more blister heads because no matter what, unless their heads explode, they have a chance of coming back as, again, blister heads. But his odds are significantly better due to his action gameplay I'll touch on here in a bit. After holding out for a few minutes, Emily manages to open up the safe and obtains the last piece needed to open the door. This is off script, but I'm going to be a bit of a pedantic asshole for a moment. Why wasn't Grace able to open the safe on her own? The pattern is the exact same as the other two, so all Grace needed to do was just remember which order the buttons were, and then press those buttons. I guess maybe it could have been different, but I really don't think it was, but still, it's silly. It's a silly thing to complain about. It doesn't matter. Back to what I was talking about. However, as Grace and Emily go to open the main door, she is instead snatched by the girl that pursued you early on in the game, the same girl that was thought to be killed by Leon. Emily is taken into the basement, and Grace has no other choice but to follow her, not just for the last piece, but because she feels empathy for Emily. But before we, the player, follow suit into the basement, we cut back to Leon to see what he's been up to.
You know, I do have a question. When's the last time you brushed your teeth?
Leon wakes up tied to a chair. Victor Gideon stands in front of him, and he starts asking him questions about Leon's involvement in this whole situation. Leon makes a couple jokes and says he's got bad breath, and then promptly makes his escape. This is one of the shorter Leon sections, so in the blink of an eye, you're close to the end of the level. The majority of this pace breaker is dependent on if you want to explore the care center as Leon, since there are exclusive cabinets he can open with his axe, but they mainly contain resources, so depending on where you're standing resource-wise, it's actually not a bad idea to explore, but again, you don't have to. After Leon makes his way to Gideon's office and finds his secret elevator, because it wouldn't be Resident Evil without a secret elevator, Leon discovers that this case is larger than it led on to be, and Grace has a bigger role than either of them previously thought. We also learn that Leon and his handler, Sherry Birkin, are suffering from an infection of the T virus, the same thing that has been killing other Raccoon City survivors earlier in the game. This game is all about that fateful day in 1998. Everything comes back to Raccoon City and its outbreak, or eventually Oswald Spencer. Nostalgia is a powerful drug, so reliving the past can be a dangerous loop. We see a lot of franchises fall into this, repeating what worked and what people liked, but this game has a different perspective on nostalgia. It's not strictly about what came before. Instead, it's about closure on what came before. Leon's entire arc in this game is one of guilt, one of feeling like he's never good enough, like he hasn't or cannot save enough people, and we'll come back to this towards the end, but I've seen some complaints from people online saying that Sherry should have been in the field with Leon as the handler following the events of Resident Evil 6, but what people are missing is that Sherry doesn't feel the same sense of responsibility and guilt since she was only a child when Raccoon City went up in flames. Yes, her parents are responsible for the strain of G virus used throughout the game, but again, she doesn't feel responsible for that. Maybe she should, maybe she does. We don't know. While I don't agree that Sherry should have been on the front lines with Leon, I do think that there should have been more to explore with her character and how revisiting Raccoon City should have affected her. Leon and Sherry are bonded together by their mutual infection of the T virus, but Sherry seems pretty chill about the whole thing. Maybe her superpowers are causing it to not be as bad for her as it is to Leon, or maybe because she ages slower due to her superpowers. I don't know. All I know is that she reminds me of Oracle in Arkham City. If you've ever played that game, Batman is poisoned by the Joker's infested Titan blood from the events of the previous game, and while Batman is attempting to find a cure, Oracle is just in his ear constantly saying, "Bruce, you gotta hurry up." Okay, I'm being a little disingenuous there. There's obviously more to the relationship in that game, but the whole handler telling you to hurry up while you cough up blood thing is just a little fun comparison my brain shot to. If we go back to the start of the video, I said a requiem is a moment where you look at everything that has led up to the present and reconcile. This is supposedly what Leon's story is about. Every cutscene with Leon in this game shows us how much he's reflecting on the past and all of his mistakes, all of the people who he couldn't save instead of thinking about the people who he did save. This premise is a promising one because this marks the fourth mainline playable Leon game, and it makes sense to think about everything that has happened from the events of RE2 up until now, but I think the way that this game handles guilt is rather poor. We don't really explore Leon as a soldier. We see his guilt as a rookie cop, again, who couldn't really do anything about Raccoon City, but this game doesn't seem very interested in the events of RE4 or 6. We see footage interspersed with various landmarks later in the game, but all the footage comes from the remake of Resident Evil 2. We don't see anything from 4 or 6. I feel like it would have been a lot more interesting to not show any sort of flashbacks when it came to Leon because it would have allowed the player to come to conclusions of his guilt on their own terms, think about whatever game they want to. However, since this game is infatuated with Raccoon City and showing Leon specifically thinking about the events of Resident Evil 2, we are no longer left with that ambiguity. It makes sense. He's in Raccoon City, so the game is centered around the events of Raccoon City and Resident Evil 2. too, but Leon's struggle bus can only go so far since it felt like Resident Evil 4's remake closed the thread on Leon's struggle for the most part. The original felt kind of divorced from its predecessor, but when Capcom started remaking these games, they felt the need to tie everything in a little neater, and it does work when you look at the larger picture, but now, here we are in Requiem, and Leon is confronted with that same problem he's been confronting from the last game that released a few years prior. I've seen some people say that Leon felt tacked on, or that Jill would have been a better protagonist since his story feels a little redundant, while Jill could have had some character work done and that would have made for a better story. I disagree with both parts of this idea, as to me, it's clear that Leon's inclusion was one of a gameplay-focused decision, since his gameplay goes all the way into that action combat loop. His story may not feel the most fleshed out, but it's the reason why Grace is center stage in this game, and not Leon. It's her story first and foremost. Leon serves as both a narrative and gameplay pace breaker, so the game can have essentially the best of both worlds, for both action and traditional survival horror. Resident Evil as an overarching narrative has never been anything to write home about. Most of the time the story is serviceable, but the charm comes from just how committed to the bit each game is. From schlocky B-movie horror to even cheesier action movie shenanigans with one-liners and the occasional racist caricature, back around to grindhouse horror, Resident Evil is a franchise that can be applied to a lot of different formats, and the story is often built around the theme of the game, much like an amusement park ride. The ride this time around is just Resident Evil themed instead of choosing a more specific subset of horror. The care center feels a lot like the Spencer estate, even down to the basement and the laboratory underneath the whole thing. Raccoon City was supposedly wiped off the map, except for a lot of our major landmarks that we know and love. Doesn't make sense? Who cares? It's dumb fun. Shut up. I like exploring the gas station. I like the RPD's front side being almost entirely fine. It's why the game sticks out in my eyes, because it encapsulates a lot of what makes the series unique. It captures the highs and the lows of the games and brings it all together. If we cut back to like 5 minutes ago when I told you that Leon figured out that Grace had something to do with this and then abruptly stopped, it's because that's how short his pace breakers are in this game. We'll see what he means in a bit, but for now, let's cut back to Grace in the basement of the care center, since this sequence specifically is one of my favorites in the entire game. In a chapter of the game I can only describe as a reference back to the remake of Resident Evil, the basement of the care center reminded me a lot of the tunnels in the remake of that first game specifically. At first I thought it was just an aesthetic similarity that I was clenching onto, but the more I thought about it, they seemed to have more in common than I thought. Throughout this section, you have to find 3 spark plugs to open a prison cell that the girl has put Emily in. The difficulty in this section comes from a couple factors. The first is that it's very dark and hard to see. Like I mentioned earlier, this game is dark as shit, and the basement is no exception. You genuinely cannot see 5 feet in front of you in this section. This doesn't do much on its own other than build tension, but when combined with the second part, the girl being a roaming boss in the same vein as Mr. X, it requires the player to have a more methodical approach to the level. In the remake of Resident Evil, the tunnels underneath the mansion had a similar feeling in the way that it was dark, obviously not as dark as it is here, but dark enough, and occasionally you would be pursued by Lisa Trevor, that game's version of the girl. In both games, these are unkillable bosses. You can't actually kill them until it's time to do their boss fight later on at the end of each section. Requiem has a fun spin on this, however, because in searching for your 3 spark plugs, you need to use whatever plugs you have to light up certain areas and open certain doors so you can get the other plugs. What this does is leave you constantly thinking about where a plug will go and what area you might need one in the future, but it also helps create a temporary safe space for the player. When the girl pursues you throughout the level, she's weak to light. We learned this back at the start of the game, so when you use a spark plug, you light up an area, creating a space that the girl cannot access. It's all just one big game of cat and mouse while you work to turn on the different parts of the level. What makes this level stand out to me is the fact that on harder difficulties, while you don't need a perfect execution, you definitely need to be close to perfect when attempting this on, say, insanity difficulty, since the girl can and will one-shot you on those harder difficulties, and when you die as Grace, you get sent back to your last typewriter save. There's no autosave. Thematically, the level is a weird combination of mining plant and what appears to be a meat processing plant, but for people. Later on in the level, in order to get the last spark plug, we need to drain a pool of blood and corpses, and then when crossing the now empty bottom, the purification process starts, which starts this conveyor belt that leads into a meat grinder where you must hold out. It's nothing too long or hard, but to me, it shows off just how weak Grace is physically, and that's why I want to highlight it. When you stun a zombie, as both characters do, you get the option to do a melee attack. As Leon, you do his classic roundhouse kick, but as Grace, you give the zombie a shove. The shove can be used wisely to make a zombie fall over or fall into another zombie, stunning both, but on its own, the shove quite literally does 0 damage. Nothing. You are essentially just making an escape window instead of clearing out the zombies. Resident Evil Requiem does such a good job at distinguishing between survival horror and action horror that it feels almost like an apology for how Resident Evil 6 tried to handle the ultimate horror experience, as it was proudly touted before release. Even in short 10-minute bursts, Leon has such a different style of play compared to Grace that it not only leaves both cravings satisfied, it allows the game to keep everything turned up to 11 for a longer period of time. The problem with longer horror games is that eventually it stops being scary and either becomes a cakewalk or tedious. The scares no longer matter now that the player has seen most of what the game will and can throw at them. It's why even classic Resident Evil games shifted towards action in the later half. The balancing act between Leon and Grace allows for sections like the basement and the lab to work well because we go through a lot of the same areas as both characters, and if it's not the same areas, we go through similar enough environments. The tonal shift between playstyles isn't exactly subtle either, it's pretty distinct. Recently, I had bought this game for my girlfriend as a gift since she really wanted to play it, and it was very interesting watching her play because as she was controlling Grace, she would stop and ask me if anything scary was going to happen or straight up ask me to take control. The second she started playing as Leon, however, she was just going buck wild on the zombies. The thought of a potential scary part wasn't even on her mind, and while being anecdotal, I think it's a good example as to how well the game uses tonal shifts to keep the pacing up, as it never felt like we were going too long without seeing what Leon was doing. But I've been on the basement for a while now, and all things considered, it's not a very long section, so after you make your way out, the game has a really good fake out where you think Grace gets her leg cut off by the elevator, once again sold by her excellent performance, when in reality, she's fine. Emily now is awfully quiet. Before we can check on her, we notice a helicopter outside, and conveniently, a pilot is also waiting there. However, his keys are inside of a building that's right in front of you, and he couldn't get his keys since his leg was injured, so he asks you to do it. Again, in what feels like a deliberate choice, after you leave the tunnel-esque basement, you end up taking a secret elevator down to a lab. All that blood was being harvested into the basement and was being sent down here for whatever experiment Gideon had going on in the search for Elpis. Upon finding the keys, we overhear Gideon talking to someone named Zeno on the phone about how she is the one and how, quote, Elpis will soon be found. In the most Resident Evil series of events ever, he then immediately decides to blow up the facility and laughs for like half a second and then walks away like nothing happened. You have to fight your way out of the facility and eventually make it back to the helicopter, but it becomes overrun with zombies and crashes, hurting Emily in the process. Another Leon section goes by where he helps Emily and Grace get into a church by sitting on top of a building with a sniper rifle and killing zombies. During my Insanity run, I thought this was going to be one of the easier parts of the game, but it turns out that when playing on Insanity, aim assist on controller is turned off by default with no way to enable it again, so I switched to keyboard and mouse. But it also turns out that as a part of the remixing done on Insanity mode, a few zombies will just jump you on top of the building, so you have another factor to hold off during this sequence, and they are hard to kill. Initially, I was just going to ignore this sequence altogether since I thought I didn't have much to say about it, but this part of the game highlights one of my few issues with the game on repeat playthroughs. When going through the first time around, you're given guns in a linear sequence of events. Certain guns are unlocked at certain points, and this helps guide the player into what weapon will be appropriate for that situation. For example, early on, when you fight a boss in the attic, the game hands you a shotgun and ammo, so you know to use the shotgun within this fight and not waste pistol ammo unless it becomes necessary. When you get to the holdout section as Leon after the basement on the first playthrough, you're given a rifle since the enemies are far away. When you come back to this area on later playthroughs, you aren't given that rifle. Instead, you have to use points from killing zombies to buy the rifle. Let me explain. I'm gonna have to jump around real quick, but in essence, when you get to Raccoon City later on as Leon, you have access to a store, much like the merchant in Resident Evil 4, as this is where the game opens up. You can now buy things like armor, ammo, healing, new weapons with currencies you get from killing zombies. This is essentially his item box, selling and buying weapons to maintain throughout his playthrough. On subsequent playthroughs, the point system in the store stays in from the start of the game. The only gun that you have access to initially is the Requiem and the starting pistol, because everything else you have to buy. I don't really like the system on repeat playthroughs, as it becomes entirely possible to soft lock yourself, and while some may say that this is a skill issue or user error for not planning ahead, I would disagree, because it doesn't incentivize planning as much as it railroads the player into buying certain weapons early on. I'm not one to armchair dev, I don't know better than developers, but to me, I feel like this sequence would have been better if it had an alternative route on subsequent playthroughs where the player was able to choose to either snipe or get close with the shotgun, SMG, pistol, whatever. I feel as though it would not only spice up repeat playthroughs, but allow for more player expression and frankly fun, as I don't think this sequence of sniping is particularly interesting regardless of difficulty. It's not like the courtyard where Grace needs to be protected is a separate entity or play space. After she gets inside of the church, you slide down the building and do exactly what I just said. Either way, it would still be a test of resource management, as the player would be forced to hold off zombies, as well as do the boss fight that comes immediately after. But that's the extent of my nitpicky critiques on this portion of the game. I just wish subsequent playthroughs weren't as railroaded, because by the time I got to this section on playthrough 5, I was wishing there was a way to spice it up, because the furthest this game goes is throwing a zombie on the building with you on the insanity difficulty, as I mentioned earlier. Up to this point, this game has been incredibly solid. The mystery around Elpis is intriguing. Grace and Leon have had their own things to do for the most part. The levels have been interesting with a nice pace to them, but in just a moment, the game falls victim to a series staple in which it doesn't really know how to wrap itself up. Some games are better than this than others, but one aspect of the series that seems to be a constant throughout is how the last third of the game seems to be the weakest part of the game, in my opinion. While this game never reaches the lows of something as, say, the boat section in Resident Evil 7, it's still weaker than the rest of the game. Before we get there though, we still have to deal with the girl. When we catch back up with Grace, we see that Emily is bleeding profusely. Grace tries to take her to safety, but has to deal with the girl from earlier again, which involves opening up a hatch by turning 3 cranks so that the sun can kill the girl once and for all, since she's weak to light. The girl has been a constant stalker type enemy throughout, and her sections are some of the best in the game. Her design is so gross and unsettling that even just looking at her sends chills down your spine. There were plenty of times during my first playthrough where I would hear the chains down the hall and just completely stop in my tracks. Everything down to the audio design of her walk is fantastic and creates this ever-looming sense of tension in the player. If we go way back to the Rhodes Hill Center, when we met Emily, she was in a cell, and there was actually another cell next to her that was empty. This girl, Marie, was an identical clone of Emily, but as we see throughout the logs in the game, the scientists at the care center experimented on her and plenty of other girls, which caused her to malform in the way that she does. That's why when we get the third cube, she takes Emily. She keeps her safely tucked away in the prison cell and doesn't hurt her, but she's still dangerous at this point, so we have to kill her if we want Emily to get out of here safely. But by the time we kill the girl and turn her into goop, Emily is already dead. What follows is admittedly not funny, but also hilarious in my eyes. Emily comes back as a giant mutated monster, and you play as Leon for just a brief moment and are stuck in place and have to shoot her until a cutscene starts. If this wasn't a coward's game, instead of shooting her as Leon, the game would have instead shifted back to Grace, and there would have been a QuickTime event where you have to spam the X button to get Leon to stop shooting, but by the time you fill up the bar or meter or whatever, she's already shot dead. Similar to that one minigame from God of War Chains of Olympus where Kratos has to push away his daughter. Jokes aside, Leon kills Emily, and Grace blames herself for everything that's happened, especially Emily's death. What's weird to me at this point is how Grace is seemingly just kind of written away. We don't really get much in terms of her dealing with survivor's guilt or even grief or even much of anything, as soon as she walks up these stairs away from Leon, she comes face to face with Gideon. He reassures her that she's where she needs to be and they're close to releasing Elpis, whatever that is. He opens the shutter door to reveal Zeno. I'll bring this up here since the game has no interest in doing so. Albert Wesker, to our knowledge, is still dead. He is seemingly a clone made by the Connections, a secret Illuminati type group in the Resident Evil universe. Zeno has the same powers as Wesker, but he's missing the mannerisms that makes Wesker who he is. I'll talk about it a bit more later on when he's relevant, but I have some thoughts about him.
She definitely has something to do with Elvis.
Now we're in Leon's portion of the game. Up until now, we've had these brief stints as Leon that took maybe 20 minutes at the longest, but now we get an entire unabridged section as Leon within Raccoon City. The city is covered in rubble. It feels almost like something out of Fallout. It's grimy after all these years, since it's still stuck on lockdown, nobody allowed in or out, permanently stuck in time, stuck on that day from September 30th, 1998. The destruction of Raccoon City has been portrayed a few different ways. Back in the original Resident Evil 3, the game portrayed the explosion almost like a firebomb with a shockwave of flame that engulfed the entire city, leaving nothing in its wake. Resident Evil Outbreak files portrayed the explosion closer to a nuclear blast with a big mushroom cloud in the wake of the bomb, while its sequel makes the explosion look closer to that of a burning city with a chance of survival. But arguably the most important adaptation of the explosion comes from the remake of Resident Evil 3, where the bomb leaves more smoke and dust in the air instead of a wave of flame that characterized the bomb previously. The bomb in 3 remake comes closest to how the city is characterized in Requiem, as a lot of the buildings still stand with structural damage. There's a clear crater in the middle of the city, but everything else seems relatively okay, all things considered. Most of the major roadways are destroyed, but a lot of the buildings still stand strong-ish. The explosion has always been a bit over the top, which is why I've seen some people make a big whoop over the destruction of Raccoon City. Rather, how much of it is seemingly fine compared to how they would have imagined the city, but to me, I think the city has a proper amount of destruction to get the message across. The message, at least how I view it, is that this was a messy, botched job. This wasn't something carefully thought out and considered by the government, and we know this. In this game, we learn that Raccoon City's destruction was not a deliberate choice of the government. Rather, it was to cover the tracks of Umbrella. This ties back into Resident Evil 6, where the president was infected as a cover-up, because in this game, we learned that he was going to reveal the secret that they blew up Raccoon City to cover up Umbrella's tracks, but they didn't want that getting out. Despite Umbrella as a company actually not being all too relevant after, Code Veronica, it's always interesting to me how the legacy of this one company always comes to bite our characters back in the ass. Leon gets a front row seat to this, as not too long after he arrives in Raccoon City, he learns that the missile didn't wipe out all the zombies, and not just all the zombies, as he's attacked by a giant spider. The giant spider is more of a callback to the original game in Zero more than anything, but in those games, the fixed camera made the spiders scary because they would, in essence, appear out of nowhere. In Requiem, the spider is big and hairy, so that's why it's scary. That rhymed, holy shit, and my phone just went off. The spider is probably the weakest fight in the entire game, as he's the easiest to stunlock or cheese your way around, but like every boss in this game, it doesn't really overstay its welcome, and it ends pretty fast. Leon cracks his little pun, and you move on easily to the weakest section in the entire game. Everything up to this point has been utterly fantastic, not a weak bone in its body, but unfortunately Leon-Raccoon City is just a step down in every way compared to what Grace was going through a few hours ago. In order to catch up to Grace, you must open a gate that is already seemingly rigged with part of an explosive, so it's up to you to go find and collect the remaining parts of the explosive to blow open the fence. We learn that the BSAA, Chris's anti-bioweapon organization, was here before us, but they're nowhere to be seen. Everything is hinting at a greater threat, but the BSAA stuff doesn't really seem all too important, and instead is just another connection to the previous games. In a game all about memories and the past, it's a bit odd to me that some aspects of the past are just kind of breezed over, while others linger on a bit longer than I think they should, or in some cases, not at all. Raccoon City feels like it should tie up a lot of the loose threads, but instead it just serves as Leon's set dressing so he could have a level thrown into the game for the sake of split playtime. The level presents itself as a large play space for the player to go around and solve puzzles and collect the detonator parts, but the entire sequence is actually pretty linear. What this does is make repeat playthroughs very boring, because it's not as tightly designed as something like Resident Evil 4, but it's not as free-form as the rest of the survival horror stuff. That's not to say Grace's sections or many other RE games have true non-linearity, as most of them railroad you pretty good as well, but the point I'm trying to make is that other games, and especially Grace's section in this game, make you feel like you have some sort of semblance of control or flow over the state of play. You can collect some items out of order, but not all of them. It's within that sum where the uniqueness of each playthrough can start to shine. Leon's section, on the other hand, just feels overly long for a few reasons. The first and most tangible reason is that everything you're doing, from exploring to the actual objective, feels long. The act of playing as Leon doesn't quite match the ebb and flow one would expect from a Leon section, especially from what we've been trained to expect in this game. To prove my point, I'm going to go unnecessarily in detail about how you collect each part because it's quite tedious. As an example, in order to collect the first part, you must open the shutter behind the camp, and eventually when the door opens, you'll shoot these hanging boxes. You then make your way up and kill the zombies or walk past them. You pick up the keys you need to progress and then climb a ladder. You see a generator that needs gas to open, but you won't have the gas to open that generator for a while, so just forget about that. You then climb up another ladder, collect the part that you need, and then you're forced into a little binocular section where you spot 3 antennas so you can find the other parts that you need. What makes these sections not work for me is the fact that you are in essence just repeating this over and over again. There's no flair to it, it's missing an umph or a pace breaker. There are no puzzles here. Actually, the game itself has very few puzzles, but Leon's section in particular are very bare. If we think back on a title like Resident Evil 4, that game wasn't all action. It actually had quite a bit of downtime, but you were also exclusively playing as Leon for the most part, so without switching protagonists, you needed something to fill in the blanks. Resident Evil 4 accomplished this by having you escort Ashley in combat, or solve puzzles, sometimes both at the same time, which made you consider factors outside of, will I roundhouse kick this guy, or will I suplex this guy? So if we come back to Requiem and we return to Leon and Raccoon City, it doesn't feel like there's much to do other than shoot and kick zombies. Granted, it's fun, really fun, but this complaint comes more from repeat playthroughs more than anything, as no matter how many times I played through this game, this section just never quite clicked for me. But that's just repeat playthroughs. On my first playthrough, I was bored out of my mind. And that brings me to my second reason. Raccoon City is fucking ugly. I know the city was hit by a missile, but it feels like it's missing something. If you had told me that Leon went to Toronto or Boston, I would believe you, because it just feels like any other bombed city. The color palette itself is really drab, and all the gray doesn't really bode well with the level in my opinion, because it just makes everything blend together. The only part of the level that stands out is the tail end where you walk on a skyscraper that's fallen over on its side. Everything is gray, and funnily enough, it looks better when you throw on the apocalypse filter that makes everything blue, but that's locked behind the deluxe edition for some reason. So as it stands, everything just kind of blends together and creates a gritty level, but not in a memorable way. The closest point of comparison I can think of is the Europe sections in Resident Evil 6 where Chris and whatever his co-op's partner name is goes through Europe and the levels match tonally. The ugly part is more of a nitpick to me, but it kills the flow of the level as much as the linearity, since it makes everything feel much more tedious since you don't have anything nice to look at until you get to the skyscraper. It's in this last part of the level where it tries to do anything unique, as before you were just clearing out rooms of enemies, or in the case of the gas station, holding out until you've cleared all the enemies. The skyscraper makes you think a little about what you're doing. It's the last location Leon will go to when in Raccoon City, and the whole section feels like the entire level should have been like this. It feels like a place that's been affected by the bomb in a way that makes the level fun to play. At first, you're climbing up the building as it lays on its side, establishing a sense of vertigo where the camera constantly feels uncomfortable until you make your way to the first combat encounter. What makes this encounter unique is that you have to manage to climb up this ramp with zombies in the way, but the entire thing takes place over glass, so if you shoot the glass, zombies will fall, but eliminate that space. They throw a lot of zombies here, so you can't use a grenade to clear them out because a grenade will break all of the glass. It's a balancing act, as when you climb up, there's zombies with guns and grenades at the top that can easily kill you, or worse, push you back down and break the glass. After that, you find the detonator part that you need, but now you need to find a way out. This involves scaling the skyscraper even more with more zombies. This time they have periodic traps laid out for you. As an example, on my first playthrough, the zombie at the top of the stairs with an explosive caught me off guard and he hit me. It flung me off the building and I died. Between him and the other zombies with weapons, it turns the remaining section not only into an ammo check, but a positioning check, because while there are a lot of enemies, there's also a fair bit of explosives that will kill grouped up enemies. Eventually, when you find an elevator that works, the lift takes you down, and it's actually a holdout section where zombies will drop on your head and you have to hold out until the lift falls, which brings you back to the start of the level. The flow of the entire skyscraper section feels like it should have been what the rest of the level should be, like I said earlier. It's so electric for the most part, and it introduces the player to not only a temporary gimmick like the wooden boards and glass, but it also gives the player a challenge when it comes to positioning and resource management. No other portion of the level comes close to the skyscraper section, and it's unfortunate because Leon is very fun to play as in this game. I talked about it earlier in his Grace pace breakers, but the combination of survival horror and action horror gives the game a unique pace and balance that many Resident Evil games just don't have. I just wish that this first Leon level was a whole lot better. What follows the level in Raccoon City is equal parts cool as hell as it is confusing to me. The cool aspects first. After blowing a hole in the gate, you take a bike along the ruined highways of Raccoon City, and Victor Gideon starts attacking you with an RPG he found lying around, all while being pursued by these evil-ass dogs. The entire thing is a scripted set piece, but the whole thing is having so much fun with itself that it's hard not to enjoy it. One thing I've seen people try and levy off this scene is how liking it apparently makes you a hypocrite, since the argument goes, this is no more goofy than anything present in Resident Evil 6. So, if you like this but hate that game, you're just following the horde and can't think for yourself. This is wrong for a few reasons. First of all, this isn't even close to some of the stuff you do in Resident Evil 6. In Leon's campaign alone, the first thing you do is kill the President of the United States, and it gets wilder from there, having you eventually pilot and crash an airliner in China while dealing with massive bioweapons on top of a Hong Kong high-rise. And that's only one of the 4 campaigns in the game, with Leon's being on the calmer side. Resident Evil 6 was considered a mess by many because it didn't know when to stop. It was constantly cranking itself not only off, but also up to 11, as each set piece had to be bigger, better, more explosive than the last. There were very few moments of levity in that game, essentially ditching the survival horror in favor of non-stop heart-pounding action, but the result is that you essentially become numb to the whole thing, since everyone has a 6-hour-long campaign, which results in the game being 30 hours long. And like I mentioned, the horror just wears off if your game goes on too long. Secondly, I believe this whole thing is just plausible within the fiction of the game. These games always have something goofy in there for levity, and this is the one moment of this game where something truly batshit insane happens, so I'll allow it this one time. I am the voice of reason, nobody else. Is that subjective? Yes. Is the purpose of the scene to just act as a cool bridge to get Leon to the RPD and kill Victor Gideon? Yes. The whole thing doesn't even take that long, so just writing this out has probably taken me longer than the actual set piece takes to complete. Towards the end of your little stroll on your motorbike, you have a little joust with Victor Gideon and supposedly kill him. I would try and keep the illusion up for narrative purposes that, oh, we did kill him, he's gone now, good riddance, but anyone who's played any video game ever or watched any movie knows that when you don't see the dead body, he's not dead. We just see him fly off the bridge and the bike explode, which should kill him, but this is Resident Evil, so it doesn't. Arriving at the RPD is a lot like arriving at Shadow Moses in Metal Gear Solid 4. It's a full circle moment for our hero where he's confronted with memories of the past. It just so happens that here, it's back in September 30th, 1998. When he opens the gate, he gets flashbacks of Marvin, his cop buddy that died on the first day. We also get hit with a musical stinger. The RPD from Resident Evil 2 plays over another song, and the stinger always reminds me of the Temple of Time theme that plays specifically in Breath of the Wild. I don't know why, but it just sounds really similar to me, and it would make sense because in that game, you're also revisiting something of the past. But in Breath of the Wild, it's mainly a connection with the player themselves, while in Requiem, it's both the player and the character that have a connection to this place. The character, more so if they played the original Resident Evil 2 and 3 alongside the remake. The section in the RPD is actually pretty short. You walk around a few rooms that you remember, but for the most part, you're there to grab a jacket that's still in pristine condition from the library and open the door on the other side of the building. One thing that you'll notice if you wander around long enough is that eventually, the tofu survivor from Resident Evil 2 shows up to say hi, and then he disappears. Somehow this block of tofu survived not only the events of the side mode in Resident Evil 2, but also the missile strike, which makes the tofu survivor the strongest out of anyone in Resident Evil. After we have our brief little moment in the RPD, we open the door to catch up with Grace, where we overhear Zeno explain what Elpis is. Apparently, it's the last virus created by Oswald Spencer to control human consciousness and overthrow the current use of bioweapons of war. We also learn that Emily isn't Emily, at least in the way that she's unique, as she's actually a copy of you, supposedly. They made tons of little girls just like Grace in order to figure out the password to Elpis. We then wake up in an orphanage as a young girl, one of many young girls, cloned to be like Grace apparently, and we hear screaming from across the hallway. We see a scientist shooting these little girls with red eyes and Frankensteinian scars across their foreheads. These clones, for whatever reason, have essentially gone rogue and are killing everyone in the orphanage, the Raccoon City orphanage, the same orphanage that served as Umbrella testing grounds, as we can see here. This section is a drag, not just on repeat playthroughs, even on the initial playthrough. It doesn't serve much to the actual game since it's not particularly scary considering how on rails it is, is, and the story developments feel like something that we could have just been told. I know show don't tell is a very big rule, but we're not being shown much here either. We're just hiding for like 5 to 10 minutes until we figure out what we already knew. These girls are clones. They were clones to try and find Spencer's key to Elpis because they thought blood contained memories and data. But that's why we're looking for Grace. They know that she contains the key, at least they believe she does, but there's one moment in particular that strikes me as odd. So after the orphanage sequence, Grace asks Zeno, "Was I made?" And Zeno says, "Correct." He says it just like that. He talks funny. We then see a series of glitches where Grace sees the memories of not only what she's experienced in life, but what Chloe, the girl from the orphanage, saw as well. This brings up a good question, kind of. Is Grace a clone? No, not really. The entire plot thread is kind of bad, but we won't learn more about it until we get to the arc, so just remind me when we get there, I guess. Speaking of clones, now's a pretty good time to talk about Zeno. Initially, when I was playing through the game, me and my buddy who was watching me and had just gotten into Resident Evil had seen Zeno appear at the end of the water treatment boss fight, and we both thought we saw the dead speak. Somehow Wesker had returned. But it's not Wesker, it's a clone. I mentioned earlier that the game actually doesn't tell you this, like, at all, but there's a key giveaway that I wanted to point out before we continue. When Leon encounters Zeno at the RPD, he says sorry, but I don't have time to spare, and a tyrant resembling Mr. X from RE2 crashes into the scene. But I want to focus on Zeno here, as this is the most damning giveaway this isn't Wesker at all. He says he doesn't have any time to spare, when everyone knows the real Wesker could always spare some time, even as little as 7 minutes. Which, yes, is that a stupid joke? Partially, but also it genuinely is an indicator that this is not Albert Wesker. This is a clone. This is somebody different. If we continue onwards, we can see the memories of Raccoon City haunting Leon, as he not only gets flashbacks of the shop owner from the remake of Resident Evil 2 that dies, but he almost immediately after gets into a fight with a tyrant, like I mentioned, that looks like Mr. X. Leon says that he couldn't save them, referring to everyone whom he didn't save during the RPD incident, but he can stop bastards like Mr. X. And aside from it being the obvious one-liner for the fight, I think that this is actually a very good insight into Leon's guilt. He was essentially trained from a young age to exclusively take care of bioweapons of war, but what we see in Requiem is how that's taken a toll on him, not just physically, as he can no longer do some of his more crazy moves from RE4 and 6, like suplexing, but he also feels eternally guilty for not being able to save everyone, even when it's not his fault. I will say though, it's a bit odd for this game to explore Leon's trauma and guilt, but not once mention Ada, as she's been in every game with him up to this point. They were pretty inseparable. If Leon was involved in an incident, Ada was surely there behind the scenes, or in the case of Resident Evil 2, directly involved. Much like the Jill argument, I don't think she was necessarily needed. We didn't require a section where we played as Ada Wong and we hear her say, "Man, I miss Leon," or vice versa. But when we're getting flashbacks to Officer Marvin from Resident Evil 2, you would think Leon would remember that time Ada faked her death, or something like that. Yes, he knows Ada's fine, at least he believes her to be fine after the events of Resident Evil 6, but still, I think that insight would have been nicer to have than to leave out. Moving away from Ada though, everything about Leon's section, not just the RPD, but everything, screams nostalgia, but not quite nostalgia for the sake of it. There's a purpose to everything here. Exploring the depths of Raccoon City is interesting because you get to see just how bad the explosion did hit parts of the city. It feels like, as I mentioned earlier, you're walking around Fallout at times, and below the city you fight a giant mutated plant much like Resident Evil 1 and 2. If we follow the traditional flow of RE games, after the plant or sewers, there's typically a lab. It happened earlier with Grace in the basement, but the game already hit you with an underground lab. Surely there's no way they would hit you with another underground lab. That little secret blood lab from earlier, that was some baby shit. The Ark is the real deal. If you were to imagine an evil science lab, this would pop into your mind. I mean, just look at this statue that looks like something out of Prometheus, the movie. Usually by the time we reach the lab portions of Resident Evil games, I partially clock out in my mind, as these settings really just look the same and play the same to me, especially in the remakes and recent entries. That's not to say that they're bad, they rarely are, but in my eyes, I think a lot of these games follow a certain flow, and they can feel a little samey whenever you reach the lab or the last third of the game, as I mentioned earlier. My friend and I have referred to this as the third act curse, as it feels like every Resident Evil game falls off slightly towards the third act. Despite the games never actually being too long, it always feels like they're stretching out the game to fit whatever silly thing comes towards the end. My go-to example, like I mentioned earlier, is the boat in Resident Evil 7, but obviously the most egregious example is Resident Evil 6, where each campaign has one of these moments, and there's a fourth campaign that acts as a tail-end closer where you play as Ada. But the biggest surprise to me with Resident Evil Requiem is that the third act curse doesn't really affect this game. Everything in the arc has a nice flow to it, and the casual switching of perspectives makes it so you never get bored playing as one or the other. The normal third act curse, as I would normally refer to it, takes form in this game as Leon's section in Raccoon City, as that's the steepest nosedive this game takes, and even then, that section isn't all that bad. As I made my way through the arc, I was constantly amazed by the design of the entire place. Despite being just another lab in some aspects, the constant color of the whole thing, or should I say the sterile whiteness of the whole lab, makes the environment really pop. I know a lot of the labs in the remake era, especially Umbrella Labs, all kind of look like this, but for some reason in Requiem, the lab just works for me. I honestly think it was the statue. When going through the arc, I really like this hallway right here because it looks like the laser trap from Resident Evil 4, but instead of a laser trap, the game does a little bit of a fake out, and instead Hunk shows up. Okay, it's not technically Hunk, as his name is the Commander, but he's got the same voice actor and he does the same moves as Hunk, so in my book, that's Hunk. Maybe he got a promotion. I really like Hunk's fight, as it's almost entirely about parrying and using the melee weapon, which the sound design of the axe is just so good throughout the entire game. The loud shing of the axe upon a successful parry is unmatched, and the visceral sound of the squish that comes from a successful axe kill is like music to my ears. The entire fight is just you two going back and forth, constantly swinging and dodging and parrying at one another, and initially when you defeat Hunk, it looks like you kill him, but if you go back and inspect where the body should be, it's gone. And that's what led people to believe that it actually is Hunk, because if it was just some random merc, that axe to the neck would have just killed him and his body would still be there, but his body deliberately is not there whenever you go back and return. And it's not even like you have to go far and then come back. When you go up the stairs, his body's gone. Hunk is a beloved character, so I don't think that they would just kill him off randomly at the end of Resident Evil 9 after not appearing for God knows how long, excluding Mercenaries mode. And plus, they need someone for Mercenaries mode, so they can't kill him. After we defeat Hunk, we finally catch up with Grace and Timu Wesker, where we see why Grace is actually needed for Elpis. The screen has a password in order to release Elpis, and the password, if entered wrong, will destroy Elpis. The question the computer asks is, what does the creator desire? There's this little-known biblical story called Noah's Ark. I don't know if you've ever heard it, where in this story, God was tired and upset with humanity. He flooded the world as judgment against pervasive wickedness, violence, and corruption that filled the earth. Humanity's thoughts were only evil, which prompted God to cleanse the world, except for the righteous Noah and his family. God instructed Noah to build the ark and survive the flood, taking 2 of each animal with him to ensure that they would survive the floods and be able to repopulate. It's where the hard-ass quote of, if you're gonna fight like you're the third monkey on the ramp to Noah's Ark, and brother, it's starting to rain comes from. But what does this have to do with Resident Evil? The Ark in this game was a holdout from the bombing of Raccoon City. It was the real reason the city was bombed, as to cover up what Umbrella was doing in Raccoon City, as I mentioned earlier. The Ark in Resident Evil contained the supposed secret to life, kind of like how Noah's Ark contained the continuation of life. Is it a stretch? Yeah. Do I care? No. Elpis is the supposed secret to life that the arc of the game holds, as the connections think it's the last big bioweapon of Oswald Spencer, a secret mind control virus that allows humanity to finally evolve, when in reality it's the opposite. Elpis in Greek mythology is the minor personification of hope, and in the game the password for Elpis is hope. At this point in the game, you're running around as Grace trying to figure out how to help after you and Leon escape Xeno, and what you'll come to find is a video. The same video your mom hid on a floppy disk at the start of the game in a flashback behind the portrait before the hotel burned down. On the floppy disk, we see a collection of interviews that Alyssa Ashcroft did with Oswald Spencer at the end of his life. She asks him about his legacy and what he wants to leave behind, and he goes on about how he opened Pandora's box with his research. He admits that he was wrong, how humans need hope, and he is plagued by guilt. He says happiness can't be achieved at the expense of others. He ends the interview early, and his assistant brings a baby into the room and says that this is his hope before giving the baby to Alyssa. That baby is Grace. She was adopted by Spencer and then given over to Alyssa before saying his piece. Spencer, realizing he was wrong, should serve as a requiem for those who have passed. I did a little bit of a sequence break to get to the video there because that's the interesting part of the level. For as beautiful as the arc is to explore and look around, there's not really a whole lot to do within the environment. The objectives are all pretty simple. It's just collect a few things and open a door. When you're playing as Grace, this is where they introduce lickers and a new type of zombie, so you have to be fast while also sneaking around. It shifts up the gameplay a little bit, but nothing too groundbreaking, and then Leon is just more Leon gameplay. Okay, that's not entirely true, as we see Leon's condition getting worse. The screen turns purple and he coughs up blood every now and again, but other than that, nothing really changed. But after the revelation with Spencer, Grace and Leon catch back up with one another, and they walk back out to the computer where Zeno was and is still waiting. Grace says she has an idea and tells Zeno to let Leon live if she punches in the password. You are then presented with a choice. Do you destroy Elpis or release it? Let's start with destroying Elpis, because that's got some shock value to it. You hear Spencer say that he was wrong, and Leon says we need to destroy Elpis, so you deliberately punch in the wrong password. This makes Zeno mad as everything starts to self-destruct, and he tries to hold you back, but Leon helps you escape before staying back to try and fight Zeno, but obviously he doesn't stand a chance, even though this is just a clone of Wesker. Leon is still sick, and it took a boulder-punching Chris and Sheva to beat the real one. We see Leon say, "At least I could save you," to Grace, before Zeno pulls out his frankly too large pistol and shoots Leon in the face. His head fucking explodes, and it's all topped off by what I can only describe as Leon's actor actually being killed in the studio right in front of Grace's voice actress, as the noise she makes is far too good and convincing. Grace is saved by a helicopter Leon had called in earlier, and Grace looks back and says, "I wish I could have saved you, Leon." It's a new cycle of survivor's guilt being created once more. Grace doesn't save anyone if you choose this ending. Emily is dead, her mom is dead, and now Leon is dead, and she wasn't able to do anything. This is clearly the bad ending, as you don't get any fanfare, a final boss, or anything. The game just ends on a somber note. I've seen some people say that they prefer this ending to the proper ending, but I don't think anyone actually does outside of the shock value of seeing Leon's head pop like a watermelon. It would be a very ballsy move to kill off a member of the lead ensemble cast in any of these games, but that's not the type of franchise Resident Evil is. If you are a recurring character, 9 times out of 10, you are safe, and there's no issue with that. These games are dumb fun. I've been talking a lot about the story of this game despite it not being very good because it's stupid, but it's also fun. The characters are what make this series fun, and even if I don't always care for the ensemble cast, and I like some of the new characters more than I like some of the ensemble traditional leads, it doesn't matter. They're not going to kill Leon, they're not going to kill Jill, they're not going to kill Chris, it doesn't matter. The closest we've gotten to these games actually killing a main character is when they killed Ethan Winters back in Resident Evil 8, but that's because they really just had nowhere else to go with Ethan. The proper resolution of the story is a lot better since you type in the password Hope and Elpis is revealed. Leon asks why you do it, and before Grace could explain it, Zeno just shoves one in his neck, which causes him to lose his powers. Elpis was a cure for all the bioweapons because Spencer regretted what he did. Zeno loses his powers and Leon is restored to full health as Victor Gideon shows up again despite him exploding last time we saw him. Gideon suggests that Grace and Emily weren't related at all. The cloning process was essentially a sham, and with Elpis, the world order will be thrown off, as at this point, each major world superpower has a bioweapon, but Elpis makes that useless. This basically ushers in a new sort of nuclear age, like the actual nuclear age, and the rush to get bioweapons. This new era will be an attempt to get Elpis by a lot of major superpowers. You can tell this is actually the good ending as we get a boss fight this time around, but there's a small caveat to that. This is just the Nemesis final fight from the remake of Resident Evil 3, but this time you can parry his arms. The fight is flashy, it's fun, and importantly, it's stupid, but the fight itself is nothing to write home about. It felt like the game knew it was done, so it kind of just threw something together at the last minute to make the player feel like a badass, but what it does, at least for me, is just feel a bit lazy. It's not like this whole game was a remake of a remake of a remake, and you could probably tie this into the whole Echoes of the Past thing, like when we fought the Tyrant, but to me, this doesn't feel like an intentional callback. Rather, they felt like they could reuse it and nobody would notice since the remake of 3 wasn't as popular as the others. Either way, it's fine, I guess. The pair are thought to be stuck underground in the bunker, but they're saved by the BSAA, Chris Redfield's organization, where apparently he has a message for Leon. We don't know what the message is, and that'll probably come in the form of DLC later on, but regardless, everyone gets their happy ending this time. Sherry is cured, Leon is cured, they have Elpis, and we learn that Emily is actually okay. Grace is still bummed because she thinks Emily died back at water treatment, but Leon reveals that she's actually fine because he didn't hit any vital organs, which is bullshit because I know damn well I shot her in the heart and the head a few times. That's the partial reason I made the joke about the QuickTime event early on when playing as Leon, because the twist doesn't really work if you shoot her in the head like I did. It's a small nitpick, but it's funny, so I don't care. But everything just kind of wraps itself up really fast in this game, like it almost abruptly ends. It's kind of weird. Resident Evil Requiem is a game that seems like it would be trying to balance too much. It's the 30th anniversary release title, and even though that wasn't entirely intended by Capcom or the development team, the themes of the game line up with that of an anniversary title. The echoes of the past come back to haunt Leon as his survivor's guilt is this pressure built up inside him. He can't help but to try and save everyone, and you can't always do that, so when you meet Grace, you can see a little bit of him inside her as well. She tries to help everyone in this game, but for the most part, she thinks everyone dies like I mentioned, and it's not until the end where she learns that Emily is okay. Despite Leon being a huge part of the marketing, he has the Porsche, he has the Hamilton watch, he has the bigger picture on the key art. Grace is the heart of this game. She'll probably never make another appearance in a Resident Evil game because that's the nature of these games and how they handle protagonists, but as I gushed all the way back at the start of this video, she steals the show in every scene that she's in. Both the facial capture and the voice actress do a fantastic job at selling the character, and I'd go as far as to say that her performance makes the game for me. Everyone else is fantastic as well, but she is just a step above the rest when it comes to performances. As a part of being a love letter, or for a lack of a better term, a requiem for the series, the game encapsulates everything that has made the franchise fun and all the twists and turns the gameplay formula has taken over the years. The game takes cues all the way back from the first game up to 6. Oddly, it doesn't quite look back on the Ethan Winters games aside from the Chris stuff in the first-person perspective, but I'm assuming that's more of a recency thing more than anything. I don't think I've played a Resident Evil game as many times as I've played Requiem. Hell, I got all the achievements within the first week or so. This game just consumed my life for a brief little window. The way everything feels so good, the way it looks, the way it sounds, it's all exactly what I wanted out of this game. A lot of people would think that this game is praising nostalgia just for the sake of it, but honestly, I disagree with the idea that this is a new thing. Resident Evil is a series that always looks back as much as it looks forward. For every remake, we get a completely original game, or in the case of Requiem, we get a game that deals with the consequences of everything that came before. Usually, these games feel pretty isolated from one another, with few events that actually bleed over, aside from the obvious examples like Raccoon City. The remakes help develop the cast of characters into something a little more consistent, especially when it comes to Leon and his survivor's guilt, so to see that climax in a game was nice for once, and I hope that in the future we don't see the same arc repeated for Leon since we've already had it wrapped up twice now. I've been sitting here for some time trying to figure out how to conclude this video because as it stands, my major complaint for the game is how just abruptly it ends. Obviously it doesn't actually abruptly end as in the credits just show up, but it feels like there's a sense of finality that is missing. Zeno is just written off. There's no fight with him, he just gets killed by Gideon in a cutscene, which isn't horrible, but then Gideon does his whole cheap nemesis boss fight gimmick. He feels like wasted potential, like they needed some sort of Resident Evil 5 callback with the powered Wesker, but eventually they just didn't know what to do with him, or maybe he was just a late addition, I don't know. But aside from my major gripes with Leon's Raccoon City section being a low point in the game and Zeno, this game rocks, and right now it stands as one of the best entries in the series. It's no Resident Evil remake or Resident Evil 4 original, but the way that it combines not just these two games, but every game, like I've mentioned over and over again, creates a game with a sublime atmosphere and better gameplay. But before I repeat myself more than I probably have, I just wanted to say thank you so much if you made it to the end of this video. It means a lot, and I would like to give a special thanks to my patrons Pogo Shack and Dingo, as they're the reason I can keep doing these longer videos. This is my longest project to date, and I'm testing out a new structure with these videos to see how you guys like it. So I've been going a little more in depth on the story, more of like a, I guess, recap in a way. It's not entirely recap, but still, it's kind of like that. I don't know. I like the more freeform structure of the old videos, but if you guys like this, let me know, and I'll continue to do it this way. I don't really mind either way. This type of video gives me a little more structure compared to the old freeform stuff. So yeah, like I said, I'm tired. You can tell I'm losing my voice a little bit, but if you guys like this, just let me know. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Like I mentioned, thanks to Pogo Shack and Dingo. That out of the way, I just wanted to say thank you so much again one last time, and I'll see you in the next one. Later.